Gilmore to Andrechuk, shooting, score! Dave Andrechuk hits the 50 mark, down the backing, Clark races him. Holy Mackinac, he got three!
Good morning, Leafs fans. Welcome back to the Leafs Lounge. I am Josh, your host for today, and as always, we don't have our normal co-host Justin Kudo here with us today, but I promise you we have a good replacement. Justin is awesome, but this guy is going to be very well received by our Leaf audience. I'm sure you all know who he is. In about, let's say, about 15 minutes time, maybe less, we will be joined by sports broadcasting legend Jim Tati, Yes Guy. You probably know him by that catchphrase. He does his own show on TSN Thursday and Friday called the Yes Guy Show. And yeah, if you're like me and you've always been a big sports fan growing up around sports highlight shows, you probably remember him from his start with Global Sportsline. An absolute rock star in the business. Can't wait for him to join us. Before he does, let's kind of get into some thoughts on last night's Leaf game. Obviously, Leafs take the L, lose 4-1 to rival Bruins. Boston Bruins came into town and I'd say put on quite the display in terms of what a team needs to do to win in the postseason. Obviously, a lot of anticipation going into this game if you're a Leaf fan, knowing that this could be, talking about the Boston Bruins, our first round opponent. That's how it's looking right now. Things can change for sure, but not exactly a great game. If you wanted this to be a statement game, kind of trying to see where the Leafs are in terms of that tier of Stanley Cup contenders, left a sour taste in my mouth and can't wait to hear what Jim Tati thinks on it. But for me, yeah, it was a difficult one. Not to say they got blown out of the building, but at the same time, there was a pretty obvious gap in terms of what the Bruins brought to the ice versus what the Maple Leafs brought. Now, obviously, one game doesn't mean everything. It doesn't mean that, the Leafs have to revamp the whole team to get to the level we need them to be in terms of wanting them to be true Stanley Cup contenders. But it does make you wonder, going into the trade deadline Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern is the final chance for Brad Treliving to improve this team. What's on the shopping list now? Does that change based on what we saw last night? For myself personally, I don't think it does. I think it was always a need. There was the need to upgrade the blue line. So I'm hoping that's still what they're going to do. I don't think Ilya Lyubushkin is the be-all and end-all to upgrading that blue line, the back end. But, you also start to wonder based on the assets that the organization has, draft pick capital, prospect pool. We know the cupboards were left pretty bare by buddy Kyle Dubas, who is now looking like he's going to be a seller at the trade deadline. I'm sure Leaf fans feel terrible about that. But yeah, it'd be interesting to talk to Jim and get his perspective on it. He's obviously very well connected, has talked to every single Leaf beat writer multiple times, pretty much every week. So it'd be great to hear if he's hearing anything in terms of what the Leafs might do. Because to be honest, I think there is a fair bit of work to do here. You also look at the forward group, the core, Matthews, Marner, Nylander. I know JT sniped. He got a goal, a nice goal. But that core group didn't bring it last night. They looked, like they didn't really seize the moment. You kind of wonder if that happens again come postseason. That's been something we've seen far too often, where the core group, we know they're always going to be heavy relied on for offense, and in the regular season they have delivered every year. You can't really complain about what Matthews, Marner, JT, Nylander have brought to the team in terms of production and how that's translated to wins. So from that standpoint, they check the box in terms of what you need them to do. They've delivered. Postseason has been a very different story, as most Leaf fans know. They've been, you could probably say at best, they've been good. Nowhere near good enough and far from elite. And that is what you need, especially based on how this team has been built and how they've allocated, salary cap space. It's basically telling those core four guys and Riley, you guys are going to take us to the promised land or we got no shot. You don't have enough money to build that back end the way you would like, the way Tree Living probably would like, to be honest, from what he said, at least. And the forward depth, you end up having to rely on guys like David Camp, Callie Yarncroke, Ryan Reeves, Bobby McMahon, all nice players. But we saw last night, core four didn't really play well. There was never really much of a threat from anyone outside of that group. And I even said, I don't think they did enough. But come playoff time, we've seen it happen far too often where that support group doesn't contribute enough. And we end up at the end of the playoff round complaining about, oh, Matthews didn't do well enough. Marner didn't do well enough. These guys, they don't care. They're not elite players. They're not guys you can count on in a playoff series. But, while I think some of that criticism is fair, we also have to question the fact that, most teams going into the playoffs, you're going to get exceptional performances from the guys who have traditionally done it for you. But you can't expect Matthews, Marner to be heroic every night if you're going to have a deep playoff run. You got to get contributions, from all throughout your lineup. And the Leafs haven't got that. In the past, it's been guys like Pierre Engvall, Alex Kerfoot. Obviously, last year, guys like Yarncroke didn't deliver. Obviously, Nyes got injured. That hurt the depth. But someone else has to be scoring goals. You looked at how the Vegas Knights won the Cup last year. 4 lines all contributing. They didn't rely on 4 forwards to get them to the Cup and to win the Cup. So that's what kind of concerns me, that I think we're expecting too much from the core. And history tells us we probably can't expect them to carry us. So has Tree Living done enough today to expect that come playoff time, whether it's Nyes, Bertuzzi, Domi, McMahon, Robertson, are these guys going to supply enough secondary offense for us to have a deep playoff run? Because you definitely need that. And you also need that blue line. You need that blue line, that strong physical back end, to be protecting in front of the net, protecting your goalie, clearing bodies, clearing pucks. And we don't have that. Like, for me, I think the pair of Timothy Liljegren and Brody was an incredible disappointment, because when Riley was out with his suspension, that pair looked really good. And I think for most of us, we thought, okay, if we can find a right shot D-man to pair with Riley, we at least have 2 pairings that could be decent for us in a playoff matchup. And then you also have Benoit and McCabe, which they mostly performed very well. So then you start thinking like, okay, maybe our blue line is good enough. Not great, but good enough. Now, after how Lily and Brody looked, it makes you wonder, do we need 2 more defensemen at the trade deadline, which I don't see being possible, but I think that's what's needed. So, I think there's a lot of work for Tree Living to do. I know we're only Tuesday and we've got, basically 72 more hours till we hit the trade deadline. But, you start hearing from a lot of the reporters in terms of what's out there. And you wonder if there's really that needle moving blue liner that can change the trajectory of this team, right? Like last night, it felt like Bruins contender, Toronto Maple Leafs pretender, and that might be harsh. There might be recency bias, 12 hours after the game, but it's not the first time we've seen this, right? Like, the Leafs haven't had success against the Bruins all year. They've lost 3 games. I know the first 2, one was overtime, one was a shootout loss. So I think we know they can compete with the Bruins. The question is, can they beat the Bruins? Would love to hear if you guys want to comment on that. Would love to know your thoughts, where you're at leading up into the trade deadline, and maybe what you think will happen. Because there obviously hasn't been a lot of movement yet. So it's, way too early to pull the fire alarm to say that, the Leafs aren't going to do anything. Because most of the guys, top available targets, are still out there. Yes, Chris Tanev is gone. Would have loved to bring him in there, pair him with Riley. I think that could have been great. But there are a lot of available right shot defensemen. Even if we have to go with one right shot, one left shot, there's a lot of options out there. So, yeah, Treliving's got a lot of work to do. But if he's willing to push some chips all in, which I think you need to with this group, there are options out there. So, obviously, in terms of the upcoming week, Leafs go on have a back-to-back. We got Wednesday night, Buffalo Sabres in Toronto, and Thursday we go in Boston. So one more chance to get back at the Bruins. You would think Samsonov would get that game just to, obviously, Wall played last night, give Sammy the second game against the Bruins, see how both those guys fare. It seems like it's going to be more of a 50-50 split between them for now. And on that, I thought Wall was good. I don't think any of the goals were really bad ones, so we can't really point the finger at him. But, Swayman obviously did more to help his team. He was outstanding and has been all year. So, yeah, I think there's, the ability for some to be concerned about the goalie situation. I think Wall is the guy. I think as long as he's healthy, he's my one starter. I want to hear from Jim. And on that note, I think we can bring him in here. And I'd like to welcome to the show Mr. Jim Tati, sports broadcasting legend. How are you, Jim?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic. Can't thank you enough for joining us today. Great to have you aboard.
My pleasure.
Great. So we're kind of not sure if you're familiar. We're obviously a new podcast, very Leaf focused. So we usually try to stick to mostly Leaf topics, Leaf news, but we also do some general hockey topics. So would love to lean on kind of your expertise as a someone who obviously is very well connected, talks to a lot of the Leaf reporters to get your perspective on some topics. Great to have you here for an exciting week. If you're a hockey fan, but especially Leaf fans with the trade deadline, a mere 72 hours away. So want to touch on that with you in a bit. But yeah, I think if we can get right into it, want to get your thoughts. Leafs Bruins last night. Bruins win 4-1. As is typical in the city, there's probably a lot of hysteria and overreaction in terms of what that loss means to the team and kind of where they are in terms of a Stanley Cup contender. Would love to just get your thoughts on what you saw last night and what kind of does it change what you feel about this group?
I try not to put too much meaning on one game, but we've seen that game before. I mean, this is, and the Leafs don't have an exclusive on it. It's a team, when you go back to that game, 25 seconds in, Zacha was in on a breakaway wall with a nice save, and the Leafs controlled, I think, the next 6 or 7 minutes. They had a power play. Shattenkirk went off, did nothing in the power play, and then it shifted. Boston scored shortly after that. But what you saw on a regular basis was the star players not being able to score, and frustration crept in, and the frustration can't creep in. You didn't have puck luck, but you got to find a way. And I didn't see that. And I think when we went back to that sample size when they were on their winning streak, I've got my notes in front of me, so you'll see me look down from time to time. When you go back over that 7-game winning streak, everything seemed to be corrected. And last night was a revisit to an old familiar problem.
Exactly. And that was kind of my takeaway. I think I'm totally with you in terms of not overreacting to the one game. We've obviously seen this group play well against contenders like the Avalanche, like the Vegas Golden Knights. So we know they can play with them previous 2 games with the Bruins. They lost as well, but it was competitive games, lost in overtime in a shootout. So trying to kind of not put too much emphasis on the loss. But what did, if anything, what did last night's kind of loss, did that change what you think the shopping list should look like for Brad Treliving as we move into Friday's trade deadline?
I don't know if it changed it much, but it certainly underlined the importance of it. So at the end of the game, John DeVar said they played better in front of their goaltender than we did. And I think you would circle the
Right.
Brody Liljegren pairing is a bit of a problem. Riley Labushkin,
Yeah.
good. Benoit and McCabe, good. But there's this, there's this need to bulk up the defense. I don't know that, I'm sure they can add somebody at the deadline, but this is an ongoing problem for the Maple Leafs. Every year they're
Right.
looking for a patch or two on that blue line. And the fact of the matter is, under previous management, they drafted a lot of goaltenders. Just a minute, I got to silence that. Okay, sorry about that. They drafted
No
not a
problem.
lot of goaltenders. I was distracted by my phone ringing. They drafted a lot of defensemen, and it didn't work out. So Liljegren is the only one left, and even on the broadcast last night when I asked my co-host Josh Cloak of The Athletic, Liljegren, so this is Rasmus Sandin take 2, isn't it? And he said, well, not quite ready, not quite ready to be in the top 4. And I went, well, what, how long do we have to wait for this? Because that's the problem.
Exactly.
They drafted a lot of defensemen, and they have literally nothing to show for it.
100%. Yeah. And I think for me, that's kind of throughout the whole year and even in past years, it's always felt like that defense. And I get where we're kind of falling short in terms of having that blue line that can kind of compete with the top contenders. They've obviously chosen to allocate most of their salary cap to the core group. So kind of segueing into kind of my next question for you, I think what we've seen in previous playoff rounds is, let's talk about the core 4 in terms of what they've contributed. They obviously haven't been terrible, but I think there's always been that, after the series is done, we didn't get enough from Matthews, Marner, Tavares. If these guys aren't going to do anything more or be heroic, this team is going to fall short. And while I think that's true, I think where we also need to get, and maybe this is something Treliving can still try to acquire before the trade deadline, the secondary scoring has always been an issue. And I think last night, along with past playoff years, it's always felt if Matthews, Marner, Nylander aren't going to do it, no one else really will. Previous years, it's been Kerfoot, Engvall not being able to contribute. Now we're still looking at some of the similar names like Yarncroke, David Kampf. Do you have any more confidence in that secondary scoring? We know Bertuzzi and Domi have come on a little bit. Nyes actually had a pretty solid game. Any more confidence in that secondary scoring compared to previous years?
I'm going to say not really, and I'll tell you why. How does Boston play? How does Florida play? They both draw you into their game. So they're not trying to win a certain way. They're stopping you from doing what you can do, and then they're going to counter that. It's literally that old cliche, it's offense from defense. They shut you down,
Right.
they pull you off your game, and then they find a way to score. How do the Leafs win? They score. The core drives it, and once in a while you get secondary scoring. We saw that in the long winning streak. But I don't see that defensive posture or that template there to stop the other team doing from what they're doing. Leafs seem to be content to do what they can do, and if it doesn't work out, well, it didn't work out. You don't win in the playoffs
Pretty much.
with that. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, and I think that kind of like makes the obviously for Treliving makes it a lot more difficult because I think even if you were able to add a top 9 forward and maybe a blue liner, it kind of makes it tough to figure out, okay, does that put you over the top? Or is this something that has to get kind of reworked and maybe a total revamp of the blue line and your secondary scoring in the offseason? But the way I look at it, I don't think their cap situation is in a favorable position where you could really say there'd be major upgrades in the offseason. So where are you at in terms of should this be another all-in approach from the Maple Leafs at the trade
you mean
deadline?
at the deadline? Well, I'm not expecting the savior to walk through the door here. I mean, the trade deadline is noted for bringing in people that support or add to what you already have. If you go back over the history of the trade deadline, Show me the big name that walked in the door and then won a Stanley Cup. It doesn't usually
Exactly.
happen. It's an add-on piece that supports and adds to what you already have. And I would suggest to you that the blue line, because of the way it's constructed, is okay. But so what's the piece that walks in and pushes them over the top, and then who are you deleting? This is an off-season problem for me.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, because I think even if you did think that solution was out there, and I agree, I don't think I see a needle moving acquisition that's possible out there. You're going to have guys to, kind of similar to a Lyubushkin, a guy who can maybe give you that right shot, be physical. So it maybe improves your blue line. But based on where they are with the cap, even if you were going to add someone, who's coming up? Does that mean you're looking to move someone like Brody, who's got a no movement clause? Are you moving Timothy Liljegren, who we talked about earlier, maybe not arriving in terms of being that, very popular prospect and future of our blue line? So you can bring someone in, but you also have to move someone out. And the Leafs seem to be a little bit handcuffed in that regard.
Absolutely. I just dialed up their cap space. Their deadline cap space is $144,000.
Right.
Oops.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That does not equate to a needle moving acquisition, right?
No. So, my opinion, you're looking at adding a defenseman, but somebody has to go out. And then up front, the Domi Tavares shuffle worked nicely for a while, but let's go to the playoffs. You're talking about defensive responsibilities. You're not giving the other team anything. Otherwise, you're going to be out really fast. So Domi, so that Domi, Bertuzzi, and Nylander line defensively in a playoff series, probably not. So now you're looking at, adding a defensive center and moving Domi off the center position. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that has to be moved around there. And again, I don't know that you could solve that at the deadline.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. I mean, I don't know if you're able to reveal maybe any names you've heard, or are there any targets that you have in mind from guys that are out there that you would like to see brought in?
Well, a lot of people sort of circle around, and I think we discussed this on the broadcast last night. Adam Henrique is sort of the Swiss Army knife down the middle that would probably help that. And on the blue line, there's a number of names there, but it's sort of like adding Lyubushkin. As soon as he walks in the door, it's like he was already here. So that doesn't push it forward. That just maintains it. I don't know. Last night's game was a bit of a problem, and this week may be a problem. I call it Old Nemesis Week. Boston twice, Buffalo and Montreal. I mean, the historic value of Boston, Buffalo, and Montreal in Leafs history is I want to take the week off because it can be catastrophic.
Yeah. And I think they showed during the broadcast last night our record, the team's record against the Atlantic Division. And I think they have the second worst. They're under 500. And it's not even because they've lost 3 to the Bruins, but I think they're 1-1 against Florida. It's really just losing games against Montreal, Ottawa, Buffalo. Games you can't lose, and you could argue, it might not be that catastrophic in terms of securing a playoff spot, but it just feels like, obviously missed opportunity with those points not picked up. And those teams are on the docket for this week. So could be a challenging week for sure, based on history, as you alluded to.
Old Nemesis Week.
It's a good way of putting it. Is there anything kind of that you're looking at in terms of, I guess, the overall lineup that you feel that Sheldon Keefe maybe hasn't yet explored that you'd like to see? I mean, you touched upon the Nylander line not performing well defensively. I'm kind of, 1 foot in the water on using analytics to kind of drive arguments and base your opinions. But, you were obviously insinuating it too, I believe. The analytics on the Nylander line didn't look too great. There's about a 25% goals for percentage, expected goals for percentage. That's not going to get any easier if you're playing in a playoff style game where the ice is kind of more limited. Is there anything within the existing lineup and rosters that you'd like to see maybe tweaked? Blue line or forward group?
I think they've pretty well done it all. When I look at this group,
Yeah,
and again, this is a discussion that we had on the Leafs broadcast last night. You'll say, well, Domi, Nylander, and Bertuzzi have developed into a defensive soft spot, and that's fine. I think that the whole point of putting that line together was to develop a second look. That doesn't mean it's
correct.
etched in stone forever and ever. So I think
Yeah,
that maybe it's time to change that around, and I'd be a big fan of that. I just don't. I don't think that when you're tweaking stuff during the regular season, that's it. That's how we're going to go, because you got to do a
right.
complete reset when you're going into a 4-7 box, as I like to call playoff series, because you
Yeah,
have to have everything so you can move it around on a moment's notice. And so this line isn't etched in stone. We know it can work for a
yeah,
while, and maybe if you need a goal or something to change up your coverage, you could go back to it. But uh, I think he's pretty well done everything that you can do
yeah,
with this lineup. I'm trying to, the constant shuffling on the left side. Some of these are really, I guess, historic in terms of recent times for the Leafs. The left side,
been a
constant
problem.
shuffling. That's not new this year. The blue
No,
line, in terms of adding a patch, that's not new this year. The goaltending seemed to solve itself, which is miraculous. But at least
right.
they have
Yeah,
two guys and maybe three guys now that, depending on what happens at the deadline, that you could sort of bank on, as opposed to who is it, who's healthy. And
for
I
sure.
mean, that's a big albatross over the last 2 or 3 years.
For sure. And I guess that brings up a good point, because I don't feel goaltending should be something they try and address. Are you of the same mindset that,
Oh,
as you
absolutely,
said,
yeah.
those three guys are capable? There's even some rumblings I'm sure you've heard about, could Matt Murray be an option for the playoffs? So, so I would think overall that should give Tree Living and the Leafs more confidence in that group. Obviously you might not be walking into a series against Boston or Florida being 100% confident that you won't have the second best goaltending, but I don't think that should be a focus for the trade deadline. Are you of the same thought
Yeah.
process?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
all I'm stuck with is the Brody Liljegren pairing, and so if you bring somebody in, then who comes out? And I
Right.
mean, who comes out of the lineup? Who comes off the salary list? That's where I'm stuck. And there was talk that he'd be willing to part with his first round pick, which is, I don't have that
Mhm.
much of a problem with it, as long as it's somebody who's not a complete tire patch.
Right.
Because they've got Minton and Easton Cowan on the way up, and let's be honest here. What's that? 2, 3, 4 years away. So that's. Do you
Got
need
to think.
another guy like that? I don't know. So
Right.
I just don't know who comes out of the lineup and who comes off the books. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very complicated because, yeah, I think you've got that expectation that if you were to add a defenseman, is it possible that Lyubushkin gets pushed down to maybe your seventh defenseman? What's kind of the status of Mark Giordano? Is he available for you? But you don't really need much other, in my opinion, additions in your, bottom pair D-man. You need someone
Yeah.
who you can count on to play 22, 24 minutes with Riley. And I don't think it's Lyubushkin, but I guess for now, that's what they're looking to do. So the hope is you can find that blue liner. And I know you touch upon, obviously, Minton and Cowan, first round pick. If there was someone who maybe we're not talking about in terms of the obvious targets, where it would be a defenseman with term, if someone
Yeah.
like an Adam Larson or Colton Parayko was available, how comfortable would you be moving a first plus maybe a Cowan or Minton for that sort of minute eating defenseman? Right
Oh,
shot.
I'd be there, but I
Okay.
wouldn't be planning the parade route this year,
No.
because I think that's going to take time. And so there's another historic problem. The guy who plays with Morgan Riley. Now, when he was younger, it was always a veteran, and that was understood. But when he matured, finding the right guy to play with Morgan Riley, so he can reach the next level and he could be supported properly. Who is
Yep.
that? I mean, that's an
Yeah.
ongoing problem, isn't it?
It has been for a while. There's
Yeah.
been Jake Gardner, Ron Hainsey, Cody Ceci, TJ Brody, and they just really, Lyubushkin, obviously, they just haven't
Shen.
found that guy. Shen
Yeah.
worked well last year, I would say, but they
Yeah.
also played more like sheltered minutes, right? They were
Yeah.
getting more offensive zone starts. So it still feels like if Lyubushkin, if that type of right shot D man is who you're pairing with Riley, you're still going to have to limit the minutes that they get. And then you're relying on either the Benoit McCabe pairing or Brody and Liljegren to be your shutdown pair, which
do you see
I'm
it?
not very confident in.
No, I don't see it there.
Yeah.
No, and Benoit hasn't played a playoff game, so that might be an issue
Correct.
or not.
Good point.
He's had a great season, but what does that mean?
For sure. So if game 1 is tomorrow, who's your starting netminder?
It's Wall.
Me too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think that was sort of mapped out. So he's going to probably play Thursday in Boston. And if you're going to play him twice against Boston, he's your guy. I just think that Sammy is good, but Wall is your guy.
I feel exactly the same. Like, I love the way Samsonov, it's a great story that he was able to bounce back. I think there was a lot of talk that, maybe his career might be over. It seemed like whether it was a mental block for him, he just didn't have confidence in his game. So great story to see him back there. And it's great if you could have him as a backup. But yeah, I think Wall has proven to be the more, for me, just the way you watch him, just feels more comfortable in there, collected, not as much movement, not as much kind of sliding around. And he would be my guy as well, for sure.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
Terrific. I guess in terms of just maybe a couple more for you, if you're able to stick around. In terms of the coaching, where are you at in terms of the job you've seen Sheldon Keefe do? Do you like how he's kind of coached this group, or do you see that there are some areas of concern where, whether it's the penalty killing unit that has been struggling a lot this year, do you see kind of issues that concern you going into another postseason with Sheldon Keefe as coach, or do you think it's more on the players at this point?
I would suggest to you that that's a discussion to be held after the end of the season.
Good point.
A lot of judgments are made on the playoffs here, and I would put him in there. I don't have any problem with his coaching. I think at various points in different playoff series he would have been outcoached by personnel on the ice and situations. But to me, he's the judgment is made after they're out this year.
Okay, yeah, very fair. Yeah, because I think there was obviously, I think some were confused, obviously, when Kyle left as GM, that meant that Sheldon was not going to be brought back. But clearly, Brad Treliving saw something there and he wanted to bring him back. But it just feels like
that would have been an easy out. That
100%.
That was an out that they didn't take, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah. Like, I was kind of a little bit perplexed with the 2-year extension. I thought, okay, if you don't think that there's someone better that you can bring in, sure, bring him back, maybe top him up with a 1-year. But the 2-year extension certainly felt like a pretty big endorsement from Treliving and Shanahan. So I'm kind of been on both sides of it. I don't think he's the main problem. I feel there's so many holes with the lineup, the roster, the blue line, as we kind of alluded to, the forward depth, that until you kind of address those, it's probably a more difficult evaluation of your coach. But it's hard to look at some of the teams like Edmonton, even the St. Louis Blues, the Minnesota Wild for a bit, who have changed their coach and they've seen almost an immediate turnaround. So I feel it's too late in the year to consider that, but throughout the year, that's kind of been my pondering. Would a coach kind of change the fortunes?
Well, and I could see how you would get there. I mean, the roster is not his responsibility. He's got to make that work. So there are defensive deficiencies on that roster, and he's asked for defensive responsibility and sometimes doesn't get it. And any other coach who would replace him would ask for the same thing, maybe with different words or different style. But the request always is offense from defense. And the sooner that everybody learns that, the more successful it's going to be. And all the things we talked about, the rotation on the left side, defensive problems up front in the blue line construction, those aren't his problems. I mean, he has to make that work, but he did not, he doesn't have any say in that. It's the general manager.
Correct. Yeah. And I think obviously I would hope that kind of the additions of Bertuzzi and Domi were something that kind of aligned to the way they wanted to play. But it almost felt, especially the first even 40, 50 games, it just felt like those guys just couldn't find the right fit within this lineup. And it felt like Sheldon Keefe was holding those two guys a lot more accountable, taking their ice time down a lot. And then it just has taken a long time to find out, what Bertuzzi can bring, where he's most valuable. We've seen him obviously score a couple goals being on the power play one. So those were kind of some of the areas where I'm like, it feels like Tree Living has added players that should work in terms of maybe where this team needs to go, being tougher to play against, maybe being more physical. But first 40 games, it felt like Sheldon Keefe didn't want to utilize those guys. And maybe that held them back. And hopefully there's reason to be optimistic about what especially those two guys specifically can bring come playoffs.
Well, think about this. Maybe it's learning new habits, which is not an easy thing to do because they both played in different organizations over the years. Bertuzzi with Detroit and Boston, and Domi's played at several stops. And so to learn what the coach expects. Now, the reason I point that out is because the team they played on Monday night, the Boston Bruins, have that template down. I mean, you're talking about major changes. So in a 10-year span on the blue line, now up front, in goal. And behind the bench. And guess what? After all that, they still play the same way.
No, exactly. And you look at the lineup the Bruins had last night, and, for people who maybe don't follow the game very closely, you look at that roster and you're like, how is that still a very strong Eastern Conference team that's, obviously they've slowed down a little bit in the past few weeks here, but they still just find a way to win games. They win a lot of close games. And you look up and down that lineup and you just don't see where those kind of major impact players are, aside from the obvious stars, Pasternak, Brad Marchand. But overall, you look at the group that the Toronto Maple Leafs have, and like, how do we get that team to play at that level? And will it come anytime soon and soon enough in terms of will we see that come playoff time? Because you start to kind of question the investment in the core group and not getting the results that you would expect based on what you've kind of committed to from a contract standpoint. And I think it only makes you wonder, especially if they do fall short this postseason, do you need to consider pivoting from the core four? And obviously Marner and JT still have one more year, but where are you at in terms of, is that a discussion for you only after this postseason? Or are you, you're already pot committed? You just got to keep trying to build around those four.
Well, regardless of what we think, it's what the Maple Leafs think, which is what we're going to have to deal with. Yeah, well, this is a decision for the summer because that's when the window opens to start negotiations. I just want to go back to Boston. So when you're on the Boston Bruins, because we talked about all those lineup changes and transitions over more than a decade. So here's how Boston plays. If you don't play that way, you're not here. Simple, right? You talked about the struggle. Last 13 games, Boston 5-3-5. That's a struggle. I mean, there's five extra points there that slipped away. But those are tough hockey games. So that's their low water mark.
If only every team could struggle like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, you can always debate, and history shows that when you have four offensive players making that kind of money, you don't win the Stanley Cup. And we have tons of proof for that. So I don't know what you do with that. Yeah, I don't know what you do with that, but the file is thick on why that doesn't work.
No, exactly. And I think kind of many Leaf fans kind of are encouraged by the cap going up. So you don't want to give up talented players. You don't move a Nylander or a Mitch Marner because you're never going to be able to replace them. But you kind of start to wonder if you're getting enough from those guys, especially in playoff games. We know their regular season production has been terrific, and you're not really looking for them to do more during the regular season, but they're all well under a point per game in their playoff careers. And you get some fans talking about Nylander has been an elite playoff performer, but you've been losing in round one every year except last. You had a very quick round two. It's tough to really view any of what those core players have done as elite, right? So
well, and the other point is it's always easy to delete from your roster, move this player out. The thing that makes it work is what comes back.
Totally.
Yeah. So you could
easier said than done, right?
Yeah, we all do that. Hey, let's move this guy. Well, what are you getting back? Nothing is not an answer. So,
Right, exactly.
yeah. And,
Yeah.
you know, quite frankly, because I'm old enough to do this, if you went
Mm.
back to the original six, which had its self-imposed salary cap, meaning they weren't going to pay
Right.
anybody,
Right.
those teams had a core, and they kept the core, and then they kept adding players around the core every year. And in some cases, that could turn into a nice season, or in other cases, not. This isn't that much different. There's more
Yeah.
zeros here, and obviously there's they're higher paid. There's the four guys, and they do this on a yearly basis. They keep adding around those guys, and it hasn't worked yet. That doesn't mean it
Mm.
can't work, but
Right.
it hasn't. That's all.
Yeah, the obviously the evidence isn't that it doesn't well support the ability to run back that strategy and expect to have different results. So I think that's where a lot of their frustration comes from. It does feel like, at least with the Nylander Matthews contract, yeah, you're pot committed with that kind of at least those members of the core four. And if you do the same thing with Mitch when his contract is up after next year, are you kind of putting yourself in that position where you're going to be a relevant team, great regular season team, but falling short come postseason because you just don't have the salary cap room to add to your blue line? Because it seems like every other team has figured out that you build from the back end out, and
Yes.
we're still hoping the Leafs do at some point, right?
Yeah, and while you go down that road, just remember this: when you're talking about Marner, Nylander, and Matthews, would you have drafted other players? You can't fault them for who they
No,
draft.
can't complain about those picks.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think it's the failure of. I would zero in on one thing. For me, it's the failure of all those defensemen they drafted that didn't turn out.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on with that, because then there was also a lot, forget about even just the quality and lack of quality, but the quantity. Dubas didn't really draft a lot of defensemen. So, yes, a lot of them haven't panned out, but, you can only name Sandin and Timothy Liljegren over
Well,
to, and I
Travis
guess
Dermott, there's a
Niemela
number.
now.
Yeah, there's a number
Dermott,
of guys there. Yeah, there's a number of guys there that
yeah,
they looked at, and after 2 or 3 years or 4 years moved on from, and quite
yeah.
frankly, most of them didn't go on to bigger and better things.
No, exactly. Exactly. So there's definitely been an issue with the evaluation there.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll end with this last question.
Yep.
Again, obviously appreciate your time. For Leaf fans trying to figure out what sort of tier we are in terms of our Stanley Cup contender status, where
Oh,
would
boy.
you put the Maple Leafs right now?
You have to ask me after a 4-1 loss to Boston on home
I know,
ice.
right? It's an easy question after
Well,
4-1 loss.
yeah.
No
Well,
chance. No
well,
chance.
well, I go back to, I watched Florida play on the weekend. They're relentless.
Yeah.
That's a tough hockey team to play. They mix it up. They go on all those stupid scrums after the whistle and sucker you into penalties.
They're
I don't know that
wagging right now.
I don't know that the Leafs are equipped to deal with that. And if the Leafs win in Boston on Thursday, I'd give you a different answer.
Fair.
There's a possibility this could work, but boy, they'd need everything to fire at maximum capacity for it to work.
Yeah, no, I
It's
think
not.
that's fair.
I mean, you need the full roster to execute properly. And we did see that during that winning streak, but I'm not saying it's impossible, but that's
Yeah.
the ask. Everything has to work.
No, exactly. It feels like it's a tall task for Brad Treliving to kind of fix what needs to be fixed by Friday to put us in that kind of top tier of contenders. I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, and I think the season sort of backs it all up. They've gone from at the start of the season, most people thought they'd win the division. Most people
Right.
had put Florida and Boston in the receding category. That hasn't
Exactly.
happened, and so what the Leafs have done with the winning streak is to sort of legitimize the playoff spot.
Right.
If you'd said to me in September, this team going into the March deadline would solidify a playoff spot, I would have laughed at you. What do you mean? I thought they were going to
Right.
win the division.
Win the division. Exactly.
So it's sort of a de-escalating expectations.
Yeah, and I think that bar has changed, right? I think at the beginning of the year, as you alluded to, it was kind of like Leafs were the betting odd favorite to win the division. And all of a sudden, we're talking about, can we get out of round one? So
Yeah, and that doesn't
It's
mean
tough.
that they won't get out of round one because
Right.
I don't know what anybody expected out of Florida last year when the playoffs started, and look what happened. So
Not
I mean
much.
that's always a possibility, but what I'm telling you is for that to happen, everything has to work.
Yeah, no, I totally hear what you're saying, and I'm exactly with you. Unfortunately, I was hoping you could change my perspective on their chances, but I guess I shouldn't have expected that. That would be
Oh,
too much to ask, even from Yes Guy.
sorry, guy.
He gives a sorry guy for the send off. I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah, that's it. Sorry, guy.
Well, Jim, again, can't thank you enough for joining us today. It was an honor to talk to you. Always been a fan of yours going back to Global Sports Line. You were always kind of that great voice and face giving us the sports highlights. So thank you for everything you did, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Josh. How do I get out of here?
I think I just got to remove you from the
Oh,
stage, and
oh,
then you will be on your way.
this won't hurt a bit.
Yeah, I don't think it will hurt you too much. You'll be fine.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right. All the best,
Bye.
Jim. Take care. All right. Jim Tati. Yes, guy. That was great kind of opportunity for myself to talk to him. Unbelievable sports broadcaster, a legend in the industry. So it's really cool to get his perspective. Kind of feel the same way about a lot of the topics that we asked him about, whether it's playoff chances the Maple Leafs have, what Tree Living could look to do at the trade deadline. It really is tough because you kind of look at what those options are, as both Jim and I have talked about on this episode. There's not a lot out there. But I do feel that whether you're putting in a first round pick or a Fraser Minton, a Timothy Liljegren, Nick Robertson, I feel this has to be one more year where you're pretty much going all in. And I know a lot of Leaf fans don't like to hear that because I think you look at a game like last night, 4-1 defeat, and you're like, I don't want to trade a first round pick. If that's all we're going to be looking to do in terms of how we're going to compete against a top team, I don't want to be adding and subtracting valuable draft capital or prospects. But my kind of, and maybe this is more of a glasses half full approach, and again, delusional Leaf hat on, I don't feel this team is that far off, contrary to what a loss last night might tell some fans. I feel with the right ads, I feel this team can compete with the Boston Bruins, with the Florida Panthers. We've seen them obviously go toe-to-toe with the Avalanche and play really well. Vegas Knights, Golden Knights as well. So I know this team can compete with those teams, but I do feel there's a fair bit of work to do, and it's going to cost. It's going to cost first-round pick. It's going to cost prospects, young players that we probably wouldn't want to trade. But hey, we're about 72 hours away from finding out what Brad will or will not do. We're going to hear a lot of talk about targets. Actually, one of the things that if you came across on Twitter, there was a rumor circulating. We know Justin Hall, our longtime friend and player here, who was not exactly a fan favorite. He's available. And I believe Elliot Friedman and Jeff Merrick were speculating on would Toronto be kicking tires on Justin Hall. I think for myself and maybe for some other fans, that might be cause to hand in the fan card. You know, if they actually go after Justin Hall and bring him in, expecting that to be the fix that they need on their blue line, I might be done. Of course, I'm joking, but can you imagine if Brad Tree Living, after we've spent the whole offseason and most of this year talking about, you know, Brad Tree Living's approach is different from Kyle Dubas. He wants to build a physical team. He wants to build from the back end out. And his solution, his way to solve the problems that this Leaf team has faced over the years is to bring in Ilya Lyubushkin and Justin Hall. Like that would be incredible. That would be incredible theater for social media platforms, for even this podcast here and other podcasts to talk about. But I'm just praying to the hockey gods that is not the move they make. You know, I asked Jim about Colton Parayko, Adam Larson type. Those may or may not be realistic. I mean, I think it all depends on how much Leafs are willing to overpay. because I don't think either of those teams would be in a rush to move those players. Maybe Parayko a little bit more because of that, bad contract, and he's a little bit getting a little bit older in the tooth, you would say. Larson seems like a more unattainable target, but I'm ready to push all in because I think with the way Matthews, Nylander have performed, I think the expectation, at least, that there's more secondary scoring available, I feel this team deserves to get pieces added to it. And it might blow up in our face. You might spend a first-round pick and maybe a prospect, and you find out it didn't work because you lose to Boston in round 1. And then, obviously, everyone will say, you see, you needed to stand pat. But when you look at what we have from a draft capital standpoint or the prospect pool or cupboards, it doesn't really give you enough confidence to say, don't do anything drastic by the trade deadline and just try and push forward next year or in 2 years. But we even brought it up with Jim Tati that, their cap situation is going to be far worse next year. You've got about 20 million of cap space, but a ton of roster spots to fill. You've got Bertuzzi, Domi expiring contracts. You got Timothy Liljegren, RFA, Brody, UFA gone. Samsonov, UFA, probably gone. So you got to bring in a lot more pieces just to fill a 20-man lineup. And in doing so, based on having 20 million, you won't be able to go after big targets that maybe you can still do this year, right? Because with 20 million, you're probably getting maybe 1 or 2 big free agent targets. That's about it. Right now, if you're willing to move some pieces, like if you can find a way to move a TJ Brody, a Timothy Liljegren, a Yarncroke, a David Camp, and I think especially with those 2 forwards I mentioned, probably going to be very difficult to do because of their contracts. But if you can move those pieces for more of a needle-moving defenseman, not another Lyubushkin, definitely not a Justin Hall. If you can find those pieces, I think there is a reason to believe this team could be a contender. And with that, we will kind of end today's episode. Thank you again to Jim Tati, Yes Guy. If you want, you can catch his show every Thursday, Friday morning on the TSN radio network. He always has the best guests on the show. So if you're a big Leaf fan, always the top Leaf writers, beat writers are always on his show as guests, and he talks everything, not just Leafs and hockey. So thank you again, Jim. Much appreciated. And to our audience, I appreciate you joining us. As you know, we do this every Tuesday and Thursday around 11 a.m. You can find us live or catch the recordings on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you to Sports Fluent, who host the Leafs Lounge, and really appreciate everyone for tuning in. Next up for the Maple Leafs, we know back-to-back Wednesday and Thursday. So we will be back on Thursday morning to talk about the Buffalo Sabres game. Hopefully we're talking about a win and to preview the Boston Bruins game. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.